Hey folks, Edit from Brain Pulp TV. It is still, as of this recording, April 21st, 2018, which is the first day of the pre-release weekend for Magic the Gathering's newest expansion, Dominaria. Every time I go to say pre-release, my brain wants to regress back to being a 2-year-old. I almost say pre-release. No idea why I struggle with that word, but moving on. Every time one of these pre-releases happen, they come out with 2 new Planeswalker decks. I've already opened up one on the channel, the Teferi Planeswalker deck, and now we're opening up the Chandra Bold Pyromancer Planeswalker deck. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Planeswalker decks, a quick breakdown. They are 60-card standard legal decks that Wizards comes out with. In this case, it is a red-green deck. They have certain characteristics which are the same in every single one of these Planeswalker decks. First and foremost, they have an exclusive Planeswalker, which the decks are sort of based around. In this case, Chandra Bold Pyromancer. And there are also 3 other cards which are going to be exclusive to this deck, and a dual land which, while not exclusive to this deck, will not actually be able to be found in regular packs of Dominaria. Now, with this being the first set of a new expansion, there are only going to be cards from Dominaria in this Planeswalker deck. If this was the second expansion like Rivals of Ixalan was, then these decks will contain cards from that and the previous expansion. But because this is just Dominaria, you are only going to find Dominaria cards in this deck. As well, too, I should point out, these products are not super powerful when it comes to pre-constructed decks. They're not like the new Challenger decks, which have a fair amount of power behind them. These are sort of more casual decks meant to be played with newer players or people who just simply want to like crack open some decks. And they do come with a couple extra booster packs, so you get to even experience breaking open some booster packs and just have some fun playing. So don't expect much from the way of power. You're not going to storm any tournaments using these decks, or if you do, please record how that goes, because I think that would be kind of amazing if someone actually did some sort of like higher event with a tournament in Magic the Gathering and just used one of these straight out of the box, because the reactions from your opponents, I think, would be priceless. Maybe that's what I'll do one day if I ever get to like a, even like a GP or something like that. Just rock the Planeswalker deck and then see how it goes and what the reactions are and see if I get any wins at all. So anyways, moving on, I'm going to crack this sucker open and we're going to see what's inside. And unlike with some of the previous Planeswalker deck openings, I'm going to go more in depth when it comes to the deck itself. So I'm not going to open the deck up and show you the cards as they're sort of stacked in the deck. I'm going to order them in a specific way and talk about what I feel the thought behind the construction was and how it should most likely be played. Okay, so now that we've gone over all that, let's crack the sucker open and I can show you what is inside. Toss the box to the side there. Now, first and foremost, we have the Planeswalker, and let's try to extract Chandra without damaging the card. There we go. There we go. So I'm going to talk more about Chandra in detail in just a moment when I start talking about the deck itself. So let's continue on right now, and I will tell you what is inside this little box right here. First, and most noticeably, we get an actual little deck box. Now, it is just a cardboard deck box. It has some wonderful little artwork on the side. It's got Chandra's name on the other side, and these do fit sleeved cards. Now, I've mentioned this before in previous comments. Some folks have mentioned that these boxes would not fit their sleeved cards. They've always fit mine. I'm guessing there maybe have been some printing errors in the past, which is really unfortunate for anyone who gets like a printing error and just can't get their sleeved cards to fit in these. But for me, I know I've been able to always get my cards sleeved and to fit in these boxes, because that's pretty much where I store all these decks. You also have the deck, which is all sealed up in a little brick here. As I mentioned, I'm going to go into more detail about that in just a couple moments. You're going to get 2 packs of Dominaria, which I will be opening up at the end of this video. I'm also going to have a fold out here, which is going to talk a bit about the deck. And I can hopefully open it up. And there we go. It's going to talk a little bit about the deck. It's going to talk about Chandra. It's going to talk about some of the common card mechanics that you will find in the cards here. In this case, haste, kicker, and +1/+1 counters. So once again, you can tell even from what's described here that this is a product which is meant for newer players. And then a little bit of information on playing the deck. This used to actually have a deck list. They don't print that on here anymore. No idea why. I thought it was useful, but there you go. And then finally, you have the quick reference card. These are useful for new players, as well as players who may have been away from the game and are recently coming back to sort of refresh their memory about how everything goes down. I've actually used them still because occasionally on a show that we do on the Mana Cave, where we play live paper Magic, I question when certain things are allowed to be done, and when priority gets sort of shifted around. So this is kind of useful for that on those rare occasions where we have lapses of memory. Speaking of the Mana Cave, by the way, we will be pitting the Chandra deck versus the Teferi deck on an upcoming episode of the Mana Cave in what we call the Planeswalker Showdown, which is sort of a mini tournament we have with all the Planeswalker decks to see who will reign supreme with the Planeswalker decks. Don't know why I'm shaking the quick reference card when I'm talking about that. We're going to set this aside, and then let's dig into what you can expect to find in the deck and how I feel it's meant to be played. Okay, let's kick things off by talking about the featured card in this deck, the Planeswalker itself, Chandra Bold Pyromancer. For 4 and 2 red, you get a legendary Planeswalker Chandra, 5 loyalty. The +1 ability is add 2 red to your mana pool. Chandra Bold Pyromancer deals 2 damage to target player. The -3 is Chandra Bold Pyromancer deals 3 damage to target creature or Planeswalker. And her -7 is Chandra Bold Pyromancer deals 10 damage to target player and each creature and Planeswalker they control. So basically, a board wipe for the most part. Now, this is typical of a lot of the Planeswalkers from these decks in that, based on the power of its abilities, it's overcosted, but it's also a decent one in the sense that I mentioned this with the Teferi one, where a lot of the times when you have these Planeswalkers, you want their abilities to be useful unconditionally, meaning you don't need to have a specific type of creature or creature at all on the board, and your opponent doesn't need to have creatures for it to be useful. So her +1 ability gives you mana. It also deals 2 damage to target player. So that can be useful right away. Her -3 does sort of depend on whether your opponent has a creature, but if they do have a creature, it's a very useful ability. And then once again, it's almost never seen ultimate ability is extremely useful. But she can hit the board and immediately do something of use, regardless of what the board state looks like, which is adding mana to your mana pool and then dealing damage to your opponent. So she is definitely not the worst Planeswalker in all the history of the Planeswalker decks so far. Okay, moving on, let's talk about the cards that you will find in the rest of the deck. Okay, let's kick things off by getting the boring stuff out of the way. We have the mana base, which consists of 11 mountains and 11 forests, and then a playset of Timber Gorge, which is the dual land, which I mentioned before. Enters the battlefield tapped, but you can tap it for either red or green. Now, Timber Gorge will not be available in regular packs of Dominaria, but they are included in the Planeswalker decks here. Okay, now let's move on to the creatures in the deck and what I consider to be sort of the philosophy behind the construction of this deck and how it's typically supposed to be played. Alrighty, so right off the bat, we have a classic Magic the Gathering card, Llanowar Elves. For 1, you get a 1/1, which can also be tapped for 1 green. It is an elf druid. This is, I believe, the original mana dork, the first one they ever came out with, where it was a creature that can then be tapped for mana. And this is one of the things that is sort of a theme within this deck. There's going to be ramp in this deck. Llanowar Elves is a perfect example. It's a classic example of a card that does just that and allows you to ramp up to play larger creatures a lot sooner than you normally would. Now, you are going to get just 2 copies of that, but still 2 copies are better than none. And we have another one of these creatures, which is going to help you ramp up, an Elfham Druid. For 1 and 1 green, you get a 0/2 Elf Druid. You can tap it for green, or you can tap to add 2 green, spend this mana only to cast kick spells. Kick spells, as you'll see in a little bit, are cards and spells and what have you that have an extra cost attached to them that you can decide whether or not you want to pay. If you do pay it, you're going to get a more powerful effect usually, or some additional effect on top of the regular effect from the card. So this ramps up into regular cards, and it does a bit of extra ramp into cards that have the kicker mechanic to them. So yes, another example of a card which is going to help you get bigger stuff out sooner. Next up, we have a mana dork which gets better over time, or has the potential of getting better over time. We have Merwin the Nurturer. I think that's how you pronounce her name. For 2 and 1 green, you have a 1/1 legendary creature, Elf Druid. Whenever another elf enters the battlefield, under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Merwin the Nurturer. You can also tap this to add an amount of green mana equal to Merwin's power. Given the number of elves in this deck, it shouldn't be too difficult to get at least 1 counter on her and sort of kick off her ability to start ramping up to bigger and better things. Now you are just going to get one copy of this. And next we have the Get To Chronicler. For 1 and 1 red, you have a 1/3 human wizard. It's got kicker, which I talked about before, of 3 and 1 red. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, there is a bunch of removal in this deck, so a card which will allow you to then take some of that removal from the graveyard and put it back in your hand is super powerful. One of the things that I've noticed from playing these Planeswalker decks and pitting them against one another is that the decks that have the most removal typically do better. It's just removal seems to be king when it comes to these decks. So this is a very useful card in that it allows you to reuse some of the removal that you'll find in this deck. And now you are going to find just one copy of that in this deck. So unfortunately, I mean, I would definitely like to add a few more to this deck in particular, or any deck that has sort of like instant or sorcery speed removal. So, you know, maybe that's something to consider in the future if you want to sort of tweak this deck a little bit. Next up, we have Krosan Druid. For 2 and 1 green, you get a 2/3 Centaur Druid. It's got kicker of 4 and 1 green. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you gain 10 life. Now, life gain with a lot of cards isn't as useful as it sometimes seems. This one could be. I mean, you're not really going to be able to cast this till late in the game anyways. So it could, 10 life is a significant amount of life to gain. This could end up being a potentially valuable card in this deck. I would have to play with it a bit to realize, you know, for sure whether or not it is, but you do just get one copy in this deck. Next up, we have one of the cards which is exclusive to this Planeswalker deck. We have Pyromancer Pilgrim. For 2 and 1 red, you get a 3/1 human wizard with haste. So for those of you unfamiliar, this creature can attack and tap as soon as it enters or comes under your control. So you're going to get 3 copies of this. Once again, it is one of the cards which is exclusive to this. Not, you know, a huge game-changing card, but with aggression style decks, this can quickly put your opponent on their back heel. The toughness of 1 makes it easy to remove, but at the same time, if they don't have any blockers for it, or if you have a way to get rid of their blockers before the swing's in, this could be a quick beatdown if your opponent's having a slower start to the game. So it's not a card to completely ignore from the deck, but it's not the greatest card ever, but you are going to get 4 copies of it. Next up, we have another card which is exclusive to this deck, which is Karplusan Hound. For 3 and 1 red, you get a 3/3 Hound creature, and whenever it attacks, if you control a Chandra Planeswalker, this creature deals 2 damage to any target. This is a card which is very typical with these Planeswalker decks in the sense that there's usually one exclusive card which improves if there is a Planeswalker with the same name as the Planeswalker that comes with this deck. Now, not the exact same Planeswalker. It doesn't say Chandra bold Pyromancer. It simply says if you control a Chandra Planeswalker. So if you wanted to, I think, quadruple the price of this deck and add a single Chandra Torch of Defiance, then that would also affect this card. So it's not specific to the bold Pyromancer. This also sort of fits with the theme of the deck. Now, I mentioned how ramp was sort of a big theme of the deck. Removal is also one of the other themes in this deck, being able to burn out creatures that your opponent has, so get the blockers out of the way. And then along with the ramp and along with the burn, another sort of theme to this deck, which you'll see in a little while here, is just big stompy creatures that you want to get on the battlefield. So you're trying to ramp up into paying for some expensive burns, some expensive creatures, and in the meantime you have cards like this, which sort of middle of the road costs, which could potentially also have burn attached to them. So we'll move on to the next creature, and that is another 4-drop, I believe. Yes, it is Gaia's Protector. So for 3 and 1 green, you have a 4/2 Elemental Warrior, and it must be blocked if able. Now this is interesting. It's got a bigger sort of power to it, but it's got a low toughness. This creature can really be seen as sort of like almost pseudo removal. So if your opponent they have to block this if they have even just one blocker that's currently up and able to block. So it forces your opponent to throw a creature under the Gaia's Protector bus. Given the fact that it's got 4 power, most of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, your opponent's creature that they're going to block with is probably going to die or at least trade with this. So it is, once again, it's like pseudo removal. It sort of fits with that theme of the deck where you want to get a bunch of your opponent's creatures out of the way so that you can swing in with larger creatures and not have any resistance from your opponent. So we have just one copy of the Gaia's Protector. Next up, we have Baloth Gorger. It is a 4-drop, 2 and 2 green, gets you a 4/4 beast creature. If it was kicked, though, and it has a kicker of 4, if it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. So it's either going to be a 4/4 for 4, which still isn't bad, or it can be a 7/7 for 8, which once again isn't the best creature ever, but it's also not bad, especially if you have that extra mana available, which again, this deck is sort of built to give you that extra mana. So it's not going to be too difficult for you to get a potential 7/7 creature on the board as early as turn 4 if you do have enough ramp to pay that extra kicker. So it's not a matter of having to wait till turn 8 to be able to cast this. It is potentially possible for you to cast this on turn 4 using this deck. Not super likely maybe, but it is definitely a possibility. And that, once again, is a theme of this deck, and it's something to look out for. You're going to get 2 copies of this. Next up, you have just a straightforward fire elemental. So for 3 and 2 red, you get a 5/4 elemental creature. Once again, this is one of the creatures that you're going to want to ramp up into and try to get onto the battlefield early, because getting a creature on turn 3 or 4 like this, it's going to be tough for an opponent to deal with, given the fact that it's a 5/4 creature. So you're going to probably be able to swing in with at least 5 damage or take out a pretty impressive creature on your opponent's side as well too. And you're going to have 3 copies of that. Next up, you have Primordial Worm, which for 4 and 2 green gets you a 7/6 worm creature. Now, just like the Elemental and the Baloth before it, this is a card which is meant to hit the board earlier than you normally would be able to get it out there and force your opponent to deal with a massive 7/6 creature. Now, of course, if these creatures had trample, they'd be much better, because your opponent could block this or chump this with a 2/2 or a 1/1, providing they have enough on the board and it won't have any damage bleed through. So trample would be much better, but at the same time, given the ramp you have in this deck, if you're able to get this out on turn 3 or 4, a 7/6 is extremely difficult for someone to deal with, especially if they're playing against you with another Planeswalker deck, which may not have as hardy of removal spells as other decks might. And now finally, the last creature that you have in this deck is Grunn the Lonely King. So for 4 and 2 green, it is a 5/5 legendary ape warrior creature. It's got a kicker of 3. If Grunn the Lonely King was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 5+1/+1 counters on it. Whenever Grunn attacks alone, double its power and toughness until the end of turn. Now, this card, once again, would be absolutely bonkers if it had trample, but at minimum, it's going to be a 5/5, which will still double its power and toughness if it ever attacks alone, until the end of turn at least. And if you're able to kick it for just 3 more, it's going to enter as a 10/10 and possibly attack as a 20/20, which is ridiculous, and I don't think I need to tell you, extremely difficult to deal with if you are an opponent to this deck. So look out for this creature if you are the opponent. Maybe save some removal, but if it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a handful if it ever hits the battlefield. And if your opponent has some way to give it trample, which I don't think there is any other way to give cards trample. I could be wrong. I don't think there is a spell that gives this trample. Yeah, I just checked. There is no way for you to, with the cards in this deck, give this trample as well too. But even without trample, this is a beast to deal with. So yeah, this is I think this is one of the coolest cards in this particular deck. So this will be interesting during the Mana Cave when we battle it out. If this dev does ever hit the battlefield, I have no idea how I'd end up removing this creature. Okay, let's move on to the only artifact in this deck, and then the sorceries and instants. So here we have the Gilded Lotus, which is an artifact for 5. It can then be tapped to add 3 mana of any one color. And keep in mind as well too, artifacts can be tapped the turn they come into play. So you'll be able to pay 5, put this on the battlefield, and still be able to immediately tap this for 3 more mana of any one color. Now, with a cost of 5, it would normally take a while, obviously at least 5 turns to get out onto the battlefield, but since you have Llanowar Elves and other sort of mana dorks, which will allow you to ramp up into it, you could get the Lotus out there much earlier than you normally would, and at that point, you're pretty much going to have as much mana as you would ever need to cast just about any card in this deck, including its kicker cost. So sadly, they only give you 1 copy of this, but this could be a very, very useful card to have on the board early enough that you can start casting crazy big creatures super early, or even just casting some of your larger removal spells. And speaking of your larger removal spells, let's start off with the first removal spell, which isn't large right on the surface, but can get kicked into a bit more power. You have Shivan Fire. So for 1 red, you have an instant, and it deals 2 damage to target creature. Now, it's also got a kicker cost of 4. If this spell was kicked, it deals 4 damage to that creature instead. So for 2, it's basically like a shock, which can only be used on creatures. But for 5, you can now deal 4 damage to that creature instead, which is a much more powerful bit of removal, obviously. And you're going to get 2 copies of that. Now, another thing along with removal is you also have a bit of pump spells in this deck to help along those larger creatures, which are already pretty beefy, or, give a bit of extra power and toughness to some of those mana dorks that you may need to swing in or block with at some point. So here you have Gift of Growth. For 1/1 green, you have an instant with a kicker of 2. Untap target creature, it gets +2/+2 until the end of turn. If this spell was kicked, that creature gets +4/+4 until the end of turn. I love cards like this that have that untap creature effect because they are such good sort of sneak attacks, or sneak blocks, I should say, as opposed to sneak attacks, when it comes to giving your opponent a false sense of security. If I can speak, it's super late here. And so they'll be allowed to swing in, and then at the last minute, you can untap your creature and not just block it, but block it with a bunch of extra power and toughness to it. So a very useful card when it comes to these sort of like more gentler powered decks like these Planeswalker decks. And you are going to get 2 copies of that. Next, we have another instant in the form of Sky Pierce, or sorry, not Sky Pierce, Pierce the Sky. For 1/1 green, Pierce the Sky deals 7 damage to target creature with flying. So it's very unlikely that your opponent's creature with flying is going to have more than 7 toughness. So it's almost guaranteed removal for any flying creature you may come up against. Not necessarily, but there's a very good chance. Obviously, this would be a lot better if it was simply destroy target flying creature, but still, it's 7 damage is an awful lot for your opponent to have to deal with when it comes to one of their flyers. Next up, we have a card which I quite like the design of this card. Now, it may be difficult to cast with its kicker, but given the aforementioned ramp that is in this deck, it's not outside the realm of possibility either. It is Fight with Fire. So for 2/1 red, you get a sorcery. Would love it if this was an instant, but of course it's not. You get a sorcery with kicker of 5 and 1 red. Fight with Fire deals 5 damage to target creature. If this spell was kicked, it deals 10 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets instead. So it's basically a board sweep. I mean, not completely, but if you're playing any sort of like weenie deck, this card is devastating if you can get out with its kicker. I mean, it's already good for straight up removal without the kicker. 5 damage is pretty difficult for most creatures to handle. But yeah, if you can afford the 9 mana to cast it with its kicker, this is a ridiculous card. And once again, it's not outside the realm of possibility for you to be able to do that, given the ramp that is found in this deck. You do only get 1 copy of this card, though. Next, we have Fiery Intervention, which for 4 and 1 red gives you a sorcery, and you can choose one. These are always good, these Swiss Army knife type cards, which give you sort of a choice as to what the effect will be. In this case, the choice is Fiery Intervention deals 5 damage to target creature. Good, once again, as you can see, the power difference between these two. For 3, you can deal 5, or in this case, it's going to cost you 5 to deal 5, but you do have a secondary choice, which is destroy target artifact. So, I mean, it could be more useful for you to destroy a target artifact. Perhaps it's not a creature, so you can't kill it with straight up damage. So there is that as well, too. Once again, getting back to the main theme of this deck, as you can see with the past few cards, it's a lot of removal, a lot of damage-based removal. So this is clearing the path for your creatures to swing in and destroy your opponent. And yeah, this is like an ongoing theme in the deck. So you get 1 copy of that. Now, finally, you have the last exclusive card to this deck, which is Chandra's Outburst. For 3 and 2 red, you get a sorcery. Chandra's Outburst deals 4 damage to target player or planeswalker. So now we're not targeting creatures. We're targeting either the player or the planeswalker. But search your library and or graveyard for a card named Chandra Bold Pyromancer. Reveal it and put it into your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. So yes, this is the tutor card, which you'll see in every single one of these Planeswalker decks, which don't just allow you to search your deck, but also your graveyard, which is important because you only get 1 copy of your Planeswalker in these decks. So this allows you to reuse it again, even though it could have died earlier on in the game. Now, granted, it costs 5, so it's not going to be cheap to get to your Planeswalker, but it's also going to allow you to do damage, once again, to either your opponent or the Planeswalker. So there's a bit more burn attached to this. So it's not bad. If this had damage to a creature, I would consider this probably one of the best tutor cards when it comes to the Planeswalker decks. This one's okay. Any of the tutor cards are of course great because they allow you to get your Planeswalker in your hand, but yeah, this would be obviously better if it was targeting a creature, but still 4 damage to your opponent, or even better yet, a Planeswalker, is still nothing to scoff at. Oh, one last thing I should point out about this is that it does cost 1 less than your Planeswalker. So even if you cast this to get your Planeswalker into your hand, you're not necessarily guaranteed to be able to cast your Planeswalker the next turn. That's fairly common. There have been some cards in the past where you'll need like a couple extra mana or several additional mana in order to cast your Planeswalker once you tutor it out. But this is the most typical sort of design for these tutor cards, where it costs 1 less than your Planeswalker. Okay, so now that we've talked about what's in the deck, as well as sort of the idea behind the deck itself and how it's meant to be played, let's start cracking open the booster packs that come with these decks and see what's inside. Okay, so we have the first one here. I'm going to read off each of these cards, not fully, but I'm going to read off the title of each of these cards, and because there's only 2 packs. So, starting off in the commons, we have Benelish Honor Guard, Artifer's Assistant, Krosan Druid, Drudge Sentinel, Eviscerate, Pardic Wanderer, Sapperling Migration, Jousting Lance, Run Amok, Blink of an Eye, which has some really cool artwork to it. Our first uncommon is a card from back in the day, Icy Manipulator. Orcish Vandal. Now, in the past, I've recently learned that the way they're setting up these packs is that there are 2 uncommons, then the rare, and then a final uncommon, which is also a legendary creature. So the next card is going to be a rare card, and it is Black Blade Reforged. For 2, you get a legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. Equipped legendary creature costs 3, or a regular equip cost of 7. So obviously, it's meant to be equipped on a legendary creature because an equip cost of 7 is ridiculous. So equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. That seems pretty nuts. It's certainly not the worst equipment I've seen. I'll have to play around with it a bit and see how it goes. I would probably draft this, maybe not over everything, but I would definitely can see myself picking this in a pack that didn't have much else to offer. So yeah, and given the number of legendary creatures in this set, it will not be hard to find a target that only costs 3 to put it on. Speaking of legendary creatures, we have Valduk, Keeper of the Flame. For 2 and 1 red, we get a 3/2 legendary human shaman. At the beginning of combat on your turn, for each aura and equipment attached to it, we'll see there's perfect card for it with the rare there. Keeper of the Flame, with each equipment attached to Valduk, Keeper of the Flame, create a 3/1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste. Exile those tokens at the beginning of the next end step. So definitely something that could snowball pretty quick if you do have other equipment to attach to it or some auras. So not, I don't know. This seems like, I'm not sure if I had these in the same pack, I'm not sure which one I would pick first. I may pick Valduk first. It would be tough. I wouldn't want to necessarily pass this one, but let me know what you guys would probably pick from that pack, because I'm sort of torn between those 2. And then to finish things off, we have the Mountain and the Sapperling token. Now, there are several different types of Sapperling tokens. Not types, but the artwork is different for a lot of these tokens. Now, I apologize. I do want to plug this because it's something that I'm super excited about. I have started a Token of the Month club. We've been creating exclusive tokens for Brain Pulp TV here, and each month there'll be a new token to offer. You guys can sign up for it, and I'll be mailing tokens directly to your door. So there'll be a link that takes you to a video explaining more about it. There's also a link below in the description that will take you to where you need to go to check it out and possibly sign up for it if you're interested. So once again, it's the Token of the Month Club. I will not plug this again in this video, but thank you for considering the Token of the Month Club. Okay, moving on, let's get to the last pack. Here we go. Now, in the past, I've had some incredible luck with the packs that come out of Planeswalker decks. Not so much this time around, but maybe this one will change everything. So first up in the commons, we have Deep Freeze, Fervent Strike, Divest, Grow from the Ashes, Gideon's Reproach, which is a card that you'll find in the Teferi Planeswalker deck. Thallid Omnivore. Jousting Lance. Saproling Migration. Blink of an Eye, once again, love the artwork on this card. Seismic Shift. Our first uncommon is Champion of the Flame. Then we have Sanctum Spirit, and our rare card, because once again, these are not in the same order that packs normally are, is a Cabal Stronghold. Now, this is a card which I'm very curious about how much play it sees, because Cabal Coffers, which is really what this card's based off of, was originally printed as uncommon with a very similar ability. This is, for those of you who don't know, you can tap it for 1 colorless, or you can pay 3, tap it to add 1 black for each basic swamp you control. Now, the Cabal Coffers, I believe it was 2 and tap it, and you get black for each swamp you control, but I can't remember if you could also tap Cabal Coffers for colorless. You might have been able to, but yeah, this is definitely a card where I'm curious. I mean, I don't usually talk a lot about dollar value. I'm curious what the price of this card is going to go up to, because I know the uncommon Cabal Coffers is a bit on the pricier side, not one of the most ridiculously priced cards, but I am happy to get this card because I will probably be adding this to at least one commander deck in particular that I can think of. So yeah, and this is probably the nicest pull I've had so far with these packs that I've opened up. Anyway, moving on, we have our legendary, which is Garna the Blood Flame. I've opened this up in another pack. I'm sure I'm going to read this off though, because I didn't open it up in one of these packs. For 3, a black and a red, you get a 3/3 human warrior legendary creature. It's got flash. When it enters the battlefield, return to your hand all creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from anywhere this turn. Other creatures you control have haste. So this is a card where in one of the previous packs that I opened up, I would have definitely taken it over the rare in that card, or in that pack. I mean, once again, I don't know what the value of this card is. Ignoring like aftermarket value and stuff, I would probably still pick this over Cabal Stronghold, unless this was like a 2nd or 3rd pack pick, in which case I knew I was already in black, in which case I might pick the Stronghold. Anyways, let me know what pick you guys would probably do if it was like a draft pick, whether it be 1st, 2nd, or 3rd pack. So we then have a Swamp, fittingly, and another Saproling token. I've not seen another token other than Saproling tokens. I know there are other tokens in the set, but all I've seen so far are Saproling tokens. So there we go, folks. That is what you can expect to find in a typical Chandra Planeswalker deck. I've mentioned this before, but obviously your mileage will vary when it comes to the rares that you open up in the 2 extra booster packs that come with it. But yes, this is what you will expect to find in one of these decks. So that is it for the video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please let me know in the comments section below. As well, too, I went into way more description when it comes to the deck itself. I've read off each of the individual cards. This is something based on feedback from previous Planeswalker deck videos that I've done. So let me know if this is something you'd like me to continue on, if you thought it was useful. I would say a large percentage of the people who come to the channel are newer players. So that seemed like good content to sort of provide newer players to sort of talk about the deck a little bit more in depth than I have in the past. But once again, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. I'd love to hear sort of any feedback, and I will definitely take it into consideration for future videos. And now with all that said, take care, everyone. Thank you so much for doing everything you guys do to help support the channel, whether it's liking, subscribing, telling your friends. It means the world to me. Have a good night, morning, day, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. May all your pulls be mythics, and I'll see you all again very soon.